რეგისტრირა დოკუმენტს ეთიკის აქტი ქვია და მის ფარგლებში კონგრესის წევრებს, მათ მეუღლეებს და შვილებს აქციებით და სხვა ფინანსური ინსტრუმენტებით ვაჭრობა ეკრძალებათ, ხოლო კანონის დარღვევის შემთხვევაში ფულადი ჯარიმის გადახდა მოუწევთ. აღნიშნულ საკითხზე კენჭისყრა ჯერჯერობით არ ყოფილა. წელს ამერიკელით მომხმარებლები საშობაო საკითხებზე რეკორდულ თანხას დახარჯავენ. ამერიკის საცალო ვაჭრობის ეროვნული ფედერაციისა და Prosper Insights and Analytics-ის ყოველწლიური კვლევა ადასტურებს, რომ 2024 წლის სადღესასწაულო სეზონზე ამერიკელები 979.9 მილიარდიდან 999 მილიარდ დოლარამდე დახარჯავენ. კვლევის შედეგების თანახმად, რომელიც 2024 წლის 2-დან 9 დეკემბრის პერიოდში 7,861 ადამიანის გამოკითხვას ეფუძნება, რითეილ სექტორის გაყიდვები წლის ნოემბერ-თებერვალში 2023-თან შედარებით 3.5%-მდე გაიზრდება. გამოკითხვა აჩვენებს, რომ ამერიკელები საშუალოდ $902 დახარჯვას აპირებენ საშობაო საჩუქრებზე, სეზონურ დეკორაციებსა და სურსათზე. საცალო გაყიდვების ზრდის ტენდენციის მთავარი კონტრიბუტორი კი ონლაინ ვაჭრობა იქნება, რომელიც წლიურ ჭრილში დაახლოებით 8-9%-ით იზრდება და 297.9 მილიარდს აღწევს. ფედერაცია იმასაც აღნიშნავს, რომ მიუხედავად სადღესასწაულო სეზონის განსაზღვრებისა, რომელიც 1 ნოემბრიდან 31 დეკემბრამდე პერიოდს ითვალისწინებს, მადლიერების დღესა და შობას შორის პერიოდი, რომელიც საყიდვლებისთვის ყველაზე ცხელი პერიოდია, 5 დღით უფრო მოკლეა ვიდრე გასულ წელს. კვლევის თანახმად საჩუქრების კატეგორიაში ტანსაცმელი და აქსესუარები ლიდერობს, რასაც მოსდევს სათამაშოები, სასაჩუქრე ბარათები, წიგნები, ვიდეო თამაშები და თავის მოვლის საშუალებები. გაყიდვის მზარდ ტენდენციასთან ერთად კომპანიები კადრების მობილიზებაზეც მუშაობენ. რითეილ ფედერაციის კვლევა ადასტურებს, რომ საშობაო სეზონზე კომპანიები დამატებით 400,000-დან 500,000-მდე თანამშრომელს დაიქირავებენ. ამერიკის შეერთებული შტატების სურსათისა და მედიკამენტების მარეგულირებელმა სააგენტომ ახალი პრეპარატი ჯემპერლი დაარეგისტრირა, რომელიც კვლევის თანახმად 100%-ით კურნავს სწორი ნაწლავის კიბოს კონკრეტულ ტიპს. ამის შესახებ ინფორმაციას ფარმაცევტული კომპანია GSK ავრცელებს. პრეპარატს FDA-მ Breakthrough Therapy Designation მიანიჭა, რაც დამტკიცებასა და ლიცენზირებას არ ნიშნავს, თუმცა რეგისტრაცია მიზნად ისახავს მედიკამენტის განვითარებას, კლინიკური კვლევების ჩატარების შესაძლებლობასა და ეფექტის არსებით გაუმჯობესებას. როგორც კომპანიაში აღნიშნავენ, ჯემპერლი FDA-მ სამედიცინო კვლევის შედეგებზე დაყრდნობით დაამტკიცა. კვლევაში მონაწილე 42 პაციენტმა, რომლებმაც მკურნალობის სრული კურსი ჩაიტარეს, უპრეცედენტო 100%-იანი შედეგი დააფიქსირეს. მაგნიტურ-რეზონანსული ტომოგრაფიის, ენდოსკოპიის, PET სკანირებისა და ციფრული გამოკვლევების შედეგებში სიმსივნური უჯრედები აღმოჩენილი არ არის. ჩინურმა ავიაკომპანიებმა 2024 წელს რეკორდი დაამყარეს. ქვეყნის სამოქალაქო ავიაციის ორგანოს მონაცემებით ავიაკომპანიებმა 700 მილიონზე მეტი მგზავრი გადაიყვანეს 15 დეკემბრის მდგომარეობით. მთელი 2023 წლისთვის მათმა რაოდენობამ 620 მილიონი შეადგინა, რაც 2022 წლის მაჩვენებელთან შედარებით 2.5-ჯერ მეტია. საჰაერო მოგზაურობის ბაზრის ძლიერი აღდგენა წელს დიდწილად განაპირობა შიდა ფრენებმა, რომელიც დაახლოებით 640 მილიონ მგზავრს მოემსახურა, რაც 14%-ით მეტია 2019 წლის ანალოგიური პერიოდის მაჩვენებლებთან შედარებით. საერთაშორისო მარშრუტებზე მგზავრების რაოდენობა 2.3-ჯერ გაიზარდა, 60 მილიონზე მეტი ადამიანი შეადგინა. პიკური ყოველდღიური სამგზავრო მიმოსვლა წელს 2.45 მილიონი მგზავრი იყო, რაც 9.8%-ით მეტია გასული წლის დღიურ პიკთან შედარებით. ფრენების საშუალო დატვირთვა 83%-ს შეადგენდა, დაახლოებით იგივეს, რაც პანდემიამდელი დონე იყო. ტრანსკასპიური საერთაშორისო სატრანსპორტო მარშრუტი ჩინეთიდან გაგზავნილი საკონტეინერო მატარებლების რაოდენობა დღეში 4-მდე გაიზრდება, რაც 2-ჯერ აღემატება არსებულ მაჩვენებელს. ამის შესახებ TIT არის მონაწილე ქვეყნების საქართველოს, აზერბაიჯანის, ყაზახეთისა და ჩინეთის რკინიგზის დეპარტამენტთა წარმომადგენლები პეკინში გამართულ შეხვედრაზე შეთანხმდნენ. ინფორმაციას რეპორტი ყაზახეთის რკინიგზაზე დაყრდნობით ავრცელებს. ამასთან ლოგისტიკური პროცესების ეფექტურობისა და გამჭვირვალობის გაზრდის მიზნით მხარეები ტვირთის ნაკადის თვალთვალისა და მართვის ერთიან ციფრულ პლატფორმას შეიმუშავებენ. თვის დასაწყისში ჩინეთის ქალაქ სიანის ყაზახურ-ჩინური ტერმინალიდან ტრანსკასპიური საერთაშორისო მარშრუტის გასწვრივ მიმდინარე წლის დასაწყისიდან მე-300 საიუბილეო საკონტეინერო მატარებელი გაიგზავნა. შედარებისთვის გასულ წელს შუა დერეფანზე ტრანზიტით მხოლოდ 11-მა საკონტეინერო მატარებელმა გაიარა. 170 წლის შემდეგ პირველად შოკოლადის მწარმოებელი Cadbury სამეფო კარის ორდერის მქონე კომპანიების სიიდან ამოიღეს, რაც ნიშნავს, რომ ის უინძორების ოფიციალური მომარაგებელი აღარ არის. მიზეზი სავარაუდოდ Cadbury-ის მფლობელი კომპანია Mondelez International-ის რუსეთში ოპერირებაა. საქმე ისაა, რომ წლის დასაწყისში მეფე ჩარლზ უკრაინის მხარდაჭერმა ჯგუფმა Before Ukraine მოუწოდა შეეჩერებინათ სამეფო ორდერი ყველა იმ კომპანიისთვის, რომელიც რუსეთში ოპერირებას უკრაინაში ომის დაწყების შემდეგაც განაგრძობდა. ერთ-ერთ პრიორიტეტად ჯგუფმა სწორედ Mondelez-ი დაასახელა ორდერს სამეფო კარი 5 წლის ვადით გასცემს. კომპანიას, რომელიც სამეფო ნებართვას ფლობს, შეფუთვაზე შესაბამისი ემბლემაც აქვს დატანილი, რომელიც მიანიშნებს, რომ იგი მონარქს უწევს მომსახურებასა ნაწვდის პროდუქტ. კომპანიაში აცხადებენ, რომ სამეფო ორდერის შეჩერება მწარმოებლებს ხარჯებსაც გაუზრდით, რადგან მათ შეფუთვების შეცვლა და მათგან შესაბამისი ემბლემის წაშლა მოუწევთ. მეფე ჩარლზმა სამეფო ორდერი 386 კომპანიაზე გასცა, რომლებსაც ამ სავაჭრო მარკას მისი წინამორბედი მონარქი დედოფალი ელიზაბეტი უდასტურებდათ. ამ კომპანიებში შორისაა ნესტლე, ჰაინცი, ჯონ ლუისი და სხვა. მეფე ჩარლზ ახალ სიაში საკვებისა და სასმლის მწარმოებელი ისეთი კომპანიები ხვდებიან, როგორებიცაა მოეტი, შანდონი, ვეიტბიქსი, ბენდიქსი and პრესალტ და სხვა. ცნობისთვის ქედბერის 200 წლოვანი ისტორია მაშინ დაიწყო, როდესაც მისმა დამფუძნებელმა ჯონ ქედბერიმ კაკაოსა და სასმელი შოკოლადის პირველი მაღაზია ბირმინგემში 1824 წლის 4 მარტს გახსნა. წლების განმავლობაში კი შოკოლადის მსოფლიოში უმსხვილეს მწარმოებლად იქცა.
და გიორგი საკაზესთან ერთად მოგესალმებით ყველას.
The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma. On December 27th, the United States imposed financial sanctions on Ivanishvili. The sanctions against Ivanishvili were a part of a package aimed at limiting Russia's harmful foreign influence. According to U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, Ivanishvili's government in Georgia restricted freedom of speech and expression, carried out violent repressions against protesters, and the media derailed the country from its Euro-Atlantic path and brought it closer to Russia. The sanctions extend to Ivanishvili's assets and companies in which he holds more than 5% ownership. The decision also affects Ivanishvili's legal victory against Credit Suisse, and he will only be able to access the awarded funds with US approval. Georgian Dream is planning the inauguration of People's Power member representative Mikhail Avelashvili as president. Avelashvili was elected by 224 delegates in an election held on December 14th, where he was the sole candidate. Meanwhile, the international community continues to support Salome Zurabishvili, Georgia's fifth president, as the only legitimately elected leader. On December 23, the Prime Minister of Georgian Dream, Irakli Kobakhidze, met with representatives of major businesses operating in Georgia. Approximately 100 business people attended the meeting, which lasted for 4 hours. In an interview with BMG, representatives of the private sector who participated in the meeting noted that the majority of the discussion was dominated by Kobakhidze's lengthy statement, leaving unanswered questions that he did not address. Moreover, according to reports following the meeting, questions directed at the Georgian Dream, particularly regarding changes in foreign policy, were raised by Ramakrishnan, the owner of TV Medi, who later made an extensive statement on the matter. The National Bank published the deposit statistics for November. According to the report, the deposit dollarization ratio decreased by 1 percentage point during the past month, reaching 48.3%. In November, deposits in Georgian lari decreased by a total of 351 million Georgian lari, amounting to 28 billion Georgian gal. The banking system of Georgia strictly adheres to international sanctions. This is the response of the National Bank to BMG's inquiry on whether the MBG considers the 2023 exemption order to apply to sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act. Legally, it is likely that the exemption order issued by the acting president of the National Bank, Natia Turnava, on September 19, 2024, does not pertain to the sanctions under the Global Magnitsky Act. This is because their order regulates the enforcement of sanctions imposed exclusively due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Accordingly, the exemption applies only to individuals sanctioned within the framework of international sanctions related to Ukraine and not to other sanction regimes, including the global Magnitsky Act package. The Embassy of Germany in Georgia has released additional information regarding the decision made by the German Ministry of Economy to suspend credit funding amounting to €237 million. The suspension pertains to projects including the construction of high-voltage transmission lines in Georgia, the improvement of Batumi's water supply system, and the introduction of green hydrogen-powered buses in Batumi. Rating agency Fitch has revised the credit rating outlook for Georgian Railway from positive to stable while affirming its rating at BB-. Fitch's decision aligns with the downgrade of Georgia's sovereign credit rating outlook. And a few days ago, the agency revised the country's sovereign outlook from stable to negative. The National Bank of Georgia sold gold worth $43 million in the form of bars and deposit certificates in November, as stated in response to a question from BMG. According to the National Bank, the gold was purchased based on market demand and was subsequently sold in line with local demand. The volume of gold sold on the market in the form of bars and certificates amounts to approximately 511 kilograms. The President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, has apologized for the damage and crash of an Azerbaijani Airlines plane in Russian airspace, but did not state that Russia is responsible for the aviation disaster. CNN reports Putin called the President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, and apologized for the incident during a phone conversation. Georgia will be connected to Turkey by a new highway. The road along the seaside will be replaced with a new 11-kilometer asphalt concrete road, which will include the construction of a 7.6-kilometer tunnel and a 1,471-meter bridge over the Chorochi River. The project is being funded by the Asian Development Bank and its completion is scheduled for 2028. A total of 620 million Georgian lari will be spent on the new highway.
This is the Checkpoints, the last Checkpoints of the season. I'm Elena Ivanishvili, author and the host of the show, and the Checkpoints team is ready to sum up business and economics week for you. This week, Georgian Dream Prime Minister Irakli Kobakhidze met with big business leaders, including signatories of the Free Business Platform, to discuss the country's political crisis and explore potential solutions. The meeting lasted 4 hours. It highlighted differences of opinion within the business community. Comments by Levan Davitashvili, Minister of Economy of Georgia, after the meeting point that the meeting was called by the government to calm the business community and soften its concerns over Georgia's growing international isolation. Here are some comments before and after the meeting.
The threats that our country faces now should not continue in order to keep the economy. Big drop is clear in various sectors, including tourism and HoReCa sectors. One of the most important things is that the independence of business has been observed once again today, as both opponents and supporters of the government have sat down and communicated. But for those who oppose today, the Prime Minister will hold another meeting and they will speak publicly. This is the promise. I cannot state my position now, either on that or the other side.
Due to the tense situation in the country, different opinions were expressed. For me, the main thing is the only peace, stability and the development of the country. Business does not need appeasement. The economy in general needs stability. The idea was expressed to meet with the critical businesses and talk about the recent developments.
Where were you 12 years ago? Do you remember anything at all? No, you don't remember. You were in school, so let me tell you what was happening to me. For 12 years, the country has been at peace. You were neither at war nor in Ukraine's situation. Do you like what was happening in Ukraine? What did they do to the country afterwards? Do you want the same thing here? Do you want to destabilize the country? You won't succeed.
The main goal of our country is economic growth and stability, while EU integration is one of the main ways to achieve this goal. There is no alternative to this. I have not heard from any businessman at the meeting that there is an alternative to joining the European Union. There was nothing like this. There was quite active support for this direction. Due to the current geopolitical situation worldwide, our country should be cautious and walk the path of integration into the EU so as not to step on any mines. The crisis is not in business. The crisis is in the country. The solution is dialogue, accepting different opinions. We must learn to accept different opinions.
Concrete steps will definitely be taken to de-escalate the current situation. There will be more meetings to resolve everything that is happening now.
Business is one of the most sensitive sectors in the tense and unstable situation. I think this meeting was very timely and was conducted in very correct format. The Prime Minister thoroughly explained the logic of his actions. The foundation was laid today that a meeting will be held with businessmen with critical opinion. It was noted that a meeting will be scheduled in the coming days where all questions will be answered.
Everything will be fine. We have discussed everything and the Prime Minister promised us that everything will be fine. The situation in the country is difficult and this is not normal, but I'm telling you that everything will be fine. We considered many topics with the Prime Minister and it was a good, positive meeting.
We discussed the ongoing events in the country at the meeting. The business has stated its opinion, while Mr. Irakli has his own opinion, which I think is not much different from each other. It is possible that the next meeting will be held with Prime Minister with those who have a different opinion on these processes. As Mr. Irakli noted, we are going to Europe. Our path is in Europe and business also believes that our path is in Europe.
Fitch Ratings downgraded Georgia's rating outlook from stable to negative. The rating itself stands unchanged at BB level. What are the key sensitivities for Georgia? Arvind Ramakrishnan, Chief of Analytical Department at the Fitch Ratings, provides answers for the Checkpoint's viewers and followers in detail. What was the logic behind changing the outlook for Georgia in this newest report from stable to negative at this time?
There were two primary drivers behind our motivation to put the BB rating for Georgia on negative outlook. The first was a sharp increase in political and social polarization, which in our view had increased political risk. The elections were contested with the opposition not accepting the results of the parliamentary elections, and that has since now been exacerbated by developments surrounding the presidential elections as well. And we are seeing protests on the streets in Georgia, which in our view could lead to an undermining of the quality of governance over time in Georgia. The second driver was a weakening in our view of the external position or external balance sheet of Georgia, particularly given the very large drop in international reserves, about 13% month on month in the month of October. And it has largely stabilized at that level at around November. And in our view, this shows that there is a potential risk that FDI coverage may not be as much as it has been in recent years. And this could potentially herald some external financing difficulties for Georgia, though I have to stress that we don't see an immediate crisis or anything at the moment.
I will follow up on each of these accents that you just made in a bit. But first, if you look at the pace with which Fitch is following Georgia at this stage and updating its outlooks, is it fast? Is it moderate? Adequate? I mean, what would you call that process? Because I don't remember any other time where in a fairly short period of time I've seen such changes to the outlook.
Well, I mean, I agree with you that things have been quite dynamic for Georgia this year. So we entered 2024 with a positive outlook for Georgia because growth was, and frankly has since the start of this year been very strong. And we had strong fiscal performance, which saw a steady reduction in government debt levels and so on. So we expected at the start of the year that would provide a strong positive momentum to Georgia. But then given the political tensions primarily that we saw over the summer in May, especially with the passage of the transparency law, which proved quite divisive, we stabilized the outlook. And now, again, just 6 months later, with the political developments that I mentioned earlier, as well as the added stress of the reduced external international reserves buffer, we feel that the trajectory is more associated with a negative outlook, and which is why we took that step.
What does this negative outlook at this point tell creditors, investors? What is Fitch's message with this outlook?
Well, a negative outlook in general means that there is potential downward pressure on the rating, and there is a possibility of a negative rating action within the next 2 years or so. Of course, there is no guarantee that we will follow through with the downgrade, because we will, of course, monitor the developments and update our forecasts on a regular basis. So that is quite important to keep in mind. But it does show that the risks to the downside have increased compared to the previous review.
What is more important at this stage? BB rating itself, or these dynamic changes to the outlook? What would the creditors and investors would be looking at this stage?
I would say that both are important and both need to be looked at together, both individually as well as together. So firstly, credit ratings, I mean, they are supposed to provide a measure of comparability. So they are not absolute. So when we look at Georgia's BB rating, and the rating has been here for some time, then if you, for instance, just take the South Caucasus region, then if you take the countries of Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, for example, now Georgia with the BB rating poses a better credit risk at the sovereign level than Armenia, for instance, which is a BB minus, but it is weaker than Azerbaijan, which is 2 notches higher at BBB minus. For instance, and Azerbaijan, of course, has a much stronger balance sheet among other factors, both external as well as public finances. So the rating itself provides a measure of like the ordinality or how it compares with other sovereigns. The outlook shows the likely or possible direction of travel, which, as I explained earlier, for Georgia, the risks have increased, so there is downward pressure, which is why we have put it on a negative outlook.
If the downward pressure persists, what happens next?
Well, I mean, at this stage, it may be helpful for me to mention what the key negative rating sensitivities for Georgia are. So if we see a substantial increase, continuing increase in political or geopolitical risks, which could translate into negative consequences for economic performance or external financing or the quality of governance, then that could be a possible factor behind a downgrade, or either in conjunction with or separate from this, if we continue to see a sustained fall in international reserves position, either because of a big widening of the current account deficit, or more likely because of a big drop in FDI levels over time, that could also lead to potentially a negative rating action. And finally, if we see evidence of a marked weakening in the policy framework and policy credibility of Georgia, and this is in fact an area where Georgia has generally performed better than its peers, then that could also pose downside to the credit rating of Georgia.
But my question was more about what happens to the BB rating itself if this pressure continues, because is there a way from negative to something in the outlook-wise position, or this already means downgrade in the rating itself?
Yeah, I mean, a downgrade is not guaranteed by any means, and neither can it be ruled out. If we did follow through on a downgrade, then it would likely be by 1 notch to BB minus, right? If we decided to do that. Conversely, the rating could also be, the outlook could also be stabilized to back to stable, in which case the rating stays at BB. I think, frankly, it's very unlikely that at the next review, for instance, we will be revising the outlook to positive, for instance. I mean, that would be a big jump to go from a negative outlook to a positive.
Now about the main focuses that you also made, and one is about reserves, and I want to stress some of the points that might not be directly associated with the rating, but I still need your position on that. For example, there are questions why Lari is stable at this point and why it is not, due to all the pressures it has around, why it is not more on the trend of devaluation. The answer that we got, not from the NBG but from Irakli Kobakhidze, is that an important amount of reserves have been sold during this period. Is this communication important at this stage, and who should be the main communicator on the issue of reserves?
Well, I mean, communications from the central bank are, of course, important for investors, for credit rating agencies like ourselves and all market participants in order to track the economic fundamentals, obviously, and also more short-term indicators like what is happening or what can happen to the currency. Now, in terms of the currency interventions that you mentioned, now the NBG does publish data quite regularly on its FX auctions. Of course, the transactions that it carries out through B-Match, they do come with a lag, which I believe can be up to 25 days. So we sometimes necessarily have to wait for information on the transactions or the scale of the interventions that the NBG has carried out. But beyond that point, I would mention that the interventions made by the central bank in selling FX reserves in the month of October were indeed quite substantial, to the tune of $627.5 million. But I would also say that in November, they have also purchased something like $124.5 million. We understand that the NBG intends to continue accumulating reserves, but we cannot rule out further FX sales in case the lari comes under pressure again.
Can we say that at this point, Georgia has a floating regime?
Yeah, well, I mean, in theory, yes, Georgia does have a floating exchange rate. The central bank, as you know, does not have an explicit target range or a target value for the exchange rate. But of course, we have seen interventions, as I mentioned a moment ago, in order to support the exchange rate, which may not be fully consistent with say the IMF definition of a freely floating exchange rate regime. But at this moment, I would say that broadly speaking, Georgia does appear to have a floating exchange rate.
If we look some of the factors that might be helping NBG and the overall economic situation for the NBG to accumulate reserves rather than to spend them. For example, FDI numbers have been out recently. FDI is down by 55% in 9 months of 2024 compared to the same period a year before. What type of signal is that for Fitch and then for NBG as well?
Yes, this is indeed a very important piece of evidence and a very important indicator that we are tracking and we will continue to track quite closely. As you say, yes, indeed, inward FDI has declined quite sharply so far this year, but at this stage, I would view it with a bit of caution because there could be base effects as well. Because in the first half of last year, for example, there was almost a 25% year-on-year increase in FDI. So this could also be a normalization. We at Fitch are tracking this indicator quite closely, and we have revised down our expectations of FDI inflows over the next couple of years. But I have to say that at this stage, firm evidence that investors are losing confidence in Georgia or withdrawing investments or putting off foreign investments in Georgia appears to be hard to come by. So for the moment, it's more of a wait and watch scenario.
Yes, you mentioned that in our latest interview as well, that Fitch at this stage doesn't see investors like leaving Georgia or stopping their investments. But we hear different stories from the business community and from the sectors. For example, energy sector says that there are investors who have stopped their investments due to this deteriorating situation in Georgia. Also, we talked to the European Business Association, which told us that there are some businesses that have already left Georgia or are thinking to leave Georgia because of the overall situation. So, what are some of the sources that you are precisely looking at when thinking about this, or when assessing this investor sentiment, which is really important at this stage?
Yeah, I mean, in addition to talking to the authorities in Georgia, we also speak to the diplomatic community, who generally tend to have a finger on the pulse, particularly with investors from their home country who may be seeking to do business in Georgia. We also speak with multilateral institutions, with IFIs, who may also be facilitating business into Georgia, primarily by lending to support projects or lending to businesses mostly within Georgia. So and to media representatives and others as well. So these are some of the sources that we would typically consider, though it's of course not an exclusive list. And yes, I mean, we continue to look for evidence which shows or does not show that investor confidence in Georgia is being affected by the political environment.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Also, today, I don't know if you're following this news, but today there is a portal in Georgia. This is freebusiness.g, and this portal already unites more than 800 businesses who are outspoken about the political situation in Georgia. They are joining, and the list is updating. So this is what we have at this point. It's more than 800 businesses, and they are joining the two demands. One demand is new elections in Georgia, and the second demand is freeing the detainees before the New Year's Eve. So what factor could this activity from the business community, like raising their voice, be for the overall business environment and factoring this into the rating?
Well, I mean, if this development is true, then I mean, firstly, I would say that the indications that we are tracking doesn't seem to indicate that the government is going to accept to a demand from the opposition or from the president or the former president now, that the elections have to be annulled and new parliamentary elections have to be held. I mean, that is not really our base case. Now, if, as you say, business communities have made such an appeal, then it could indicate, and I'll have to look at the facts of this particular case over here, that they might be concerned.
Yes, I will send you the link later, and you can see the portal there. Yes.
Mm-hmm. That they are concerned about the image of the country and potentially about security risks as well. If that's prolonged, then that might pose a risk to the business-friendly environment of the country.
In our show, Mr. Arvind, Business Weekly, more than 60 businesses have participated, and these businesses are also joining this petition that I just mentioned to you, and they have two main concerns that they have posed in front of us. One is they have questions where their taxes are going, and they have some doubts that these taxes these funds might be used for dispersing the protests in the streets of Georgia. And another was about corruption, a systemic corruption and kleptocracy that they are facing. This is were the two main problems that they have posed during the two shows that we had in Business Weekly. I remembered you stressed WGI, the governance indicators. So are you looking precisely to these types of indicators as well, and what does the current picture show you? Because after our last conversation, WGI has been updated, and 2023 trends have been presented by the World Bank.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the worldwide governance indicators published by the World Bank are quite important for us. I'm afraid that we can't look to the WGI to interpret the latest political developments that we are talking about today, because they are necessarily a backward-looking indicator. They are based on perceptions and surveys, and it takes time for the current developments to feed through to these. What I will say is that in general, Georgia has had better governance indicators than its rating peers, and that has been, if not a rating strength, then certainly it has outperformed its peers in that respect. But I would expect that, given that or let me put it this way. It may be the case that like worldwide governance indicators currently may not adequately be capturing the extent of political polarization and the risks that it poses to policy credibility and institutional independence in Georgia. And as a result, this could lead to an undermining of the governance quality. This could, we think that like the governance quality, actually there are downside risks to that over time. Though, of course, we'll continue to track the WGI to see how they are reflected in the official numbers.
Yes, because probably you're following this very closely today. You hear the statements about the legislation being used at this point from for like political benefits and not necessarily as a reform agenda. So these are also the types of things you will be monitoring, right, and feeding into the governance indicators. Thank you for that. Also, what factor is Georgia's debt at this point?
Yeah, I would say that the fiscal factors, including the debt, were not really a driver behind the recent downward revision of the outlook. In general, we would say that Georgia's fiscal performance has been relatively strong. So Georgia has a record, at least in recent years, of overperforming budget targets. So fiscal management is generally quite prudent. And with regard to the debt level, so they are still way below the debt ceiling of 60% of GDP. So currently they are below 40% of GDP. And as I mentioned, like fiscally, Georgia has been quite prudent, and we expect that to continue as well going into 2025. So I don't see any particular pressure on the debt to GDP metric. But as you mentioned, the structure of the debt is pertinent because most of the debt is denominated in foreign currency. So if we had like a substantial depreciation of the lari, for example, then that could sharply increase debt servicing costs. So though that is not our base case. I would add that one mitigating factor is that most of Georgia's external debt is owed to multilateral and bilateral creditors, which means that interest rate risk is also relatively low. Now, in terms of debt servicing costs, I mean, barring a big interest rate shock, which I frankly don't see as the base case at this moment, we would expect that Georgia's ability to service its debt should be relatively stable. So we expect like the general government interest to revenue ratio to be stable at around 6% or so in 2025. And which is not very unusual for a country in the BB rating category.
Also, these discussions around Georgia of sanctioning the individuals, the fact that the U.S. has at this stage suspending the strategic partnership with Georgia, hearing from the government of Germany that some of the funds that were available for the government, these will be frozen to some stage. I mean, what are these factors, and do you think these factors like feeding immediately into some risks for Georgia on the fiscal side?
Yeah, these developments that you mentioned are obviously negative from Georgia's perspective. We think that, fundamentally, these are a reflection of the perception of a deterioration in Georgia's governance standards. And these things are going to take time to be resolved. For instance, just on the relations with the EU, Georgia's own prime minister has said that the accession talks are essentially suspended until at least 2028. So that's quite some time away. We do expect that development assistance from the EU could be affected, and I believe that the EU has already said it to that effect. But in terms of the impact that this has on Georgia's fiscal performance, for example, we don't really think that is going to be notable. As I mentioned, like the fiscal performance is quite strong. There is room to absorb debt as well. So the more immediate impact will be on economic and fiscal performance will be somewhat limited.
In this context, how do you view the decision to raise the excise tax on tobacco, for example? I mean, what kind of factor could that be?
In general, we avoid taking a stance on whether certain taxes are within quotes good or bad. But I would say that like taxation on tobacco and gambling, for instance, that is not unusual among many economies. And Georgia is certainly not alone in having done that. And if it does manage to expand the tax base without leading to a substantial reduction in economic activity, which I suspect will not be the case, then all other factors equal, then that would be positive from a fiscal structure perspective.
Do you think that might have some spilling effect on inflation, for example?
I would be surprised if this were a big contributor to inflation. Inflation, as you know, is already below the NBG's inflation target. We think that there is still room for inflation to catch up. So I wouldn't call this the big contributor to inflation. I think that for inflation, really, the exchange rate dynamics are quite important, and that doesn't really seem to be to have a correlation with these taxes that you mentioned.
Some analysts are stressing the importance of interest rates on state obligations, and they tell me that this dynamics of the interest rates will show whether Georgia is stepping into some kind of like economic isolation or economic problems, and this could also be a good understanding or good measure of the investor sentiments. Do you look at this factor, and what does the current situation in Georgia tell you in this regard?
Well, we do typically look at bond yields because that is a sign of what the market thinks about the riskiness of a country's debt. So from that perspective, certainly, I think it does matter. And in Georgia's case, I have not looked at the very latest bond yield data, but if there were a big sharp spike in yields, that could be a reflection of political risk premium being built in, which in turn, if that were to happen, could indicate that investors may be losing confidence, or in the credibility or in the policy capacity and institutional capacity of the government. But I think that in terms of a crisis, or the debt servicing cost for Georgia going up very sharply, for instance, I don't think I have seen indications that's the case currently.
Thank you so much. And to sum up our conversation for today, and thank you again for your time, my traditional question about the key sensitivities of the current rating for Georgia, and what are some of the scenarios that Fitch is considering at this point for Georgia?
Yeah, I already outlined the negative scenarios earlier, but let me run through them again very briefly. So on the negative side, we have three key sensitivities. So the first one, which is a structural one, is if we saw a substantial increase in domestic political or geopolitical risks, which could spill over into economic performance, access to external financing, or governance indicators or things like that, then that could pose downward pressure on Georgia's rating. On the external finances side, if we saw continued large drops in international reserves, which in turn could be a function, for instance, of sustained lower FDI levels, then that would be negative for the rating as well. And on the macro level, a weakening of Georgia's broad policy credibility, which could create risks for macroeconomic and financial stability, would also be negative for the rating. On the positive side, from a structural perspective, if we saw a reduction in the political risks, obviously, then that could lead us to revise the outlook back to stable. And then again, if we had greater confidence, if we actually saw the international reserves, for instance, like recover to healthy levels, then that could also be positive for the rating outlook.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Fitch Ratings has revised the outlook on Georgian Railway's long-term foreign and local currency issuer default ratings to stable from positive and affirmed the IDRs at BB-. The revision of the outlook reflects Fitch's view that Georgian Railway will be unable to sustainably improve its financial metrics under the agency's rating case scenario, and that the company's standalone credit profile will remain in B+. The affirmation reflects Fitch's unchanged strong expectation of extraordinary support from Georgia. BB outlook is negative. This leads to a single-notch differential between Georgian Railway's IDRs and Georgia's sovereign IDRs. How did businesses do this week? Natia Taktakishvili will provide an update.
Former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Defense Kobakhidze deeply believes that there is still a way out of the current situation in the country, as he told BMG TV. If the government continues to ignore this political crisis, the country will reach its lowest point. The political crisis is obvious, but the government stubbornly does not recognize it, which will lead us to an even deeper crisis than we are in today. Some are more radical and say that we are at the lowest point. In my opinion, we are not at the bottom yet. But if we continue to ignore the deep political crisis, we will reach to the lowest point. Any democratic government would take this seriously, would take into account the concerns of a large part of society, and would definitely take political steps to overcome the crisis and show the prospect of stable development, Kobakhidze noted. I cannot involve myself in politics, but I must emphasize that our country, businesses and the aviation sector all require peace and stability. If new elections are necessary to achieve this, then they should be held. Zakharadze, general manager of TAV Georgia, which operates Tbilisi and Batumi International Airport, said. Zakharadze acknowledged that the recent events in the country are directly affecting business operations. We have received inquiries, and I'm keen to understand their perspective. Naturally, we all agree that the state must take action to address the current situation. A measure must be implemented to alleviate tension, and if compromises are needed, they should be made. As the airport manager, I can affirm that stability is essential for our operations. We will certainly utilize this platform to enable the business community to express our views. All of the directly impacts our business, Zakharadze added. Some wine companies declare that the current situation in country, its isolation from the West, will negatively affect their exports in the future. As the company Paprisvoli told BMG, so far there have been no problems in existing contacts with Western partners, although no new agreements have been signed. According to the company's founder Shara Kurdadze, if the processes continue like this, consumer interest in Georgian wine on the European market will decrease. We are now sending our orders to our partners abroad, but it is easy to predict that this will not definitely slow down in the future. For example, if Belarus, via the produce golden tractors, European consumers would not be willing to buy them. When an anti-European image is formed for a country, this has a negative impact on consumer sentiments. The company that buys wine from us, even if it does not refuse cooperation, the mood of European customer toward Georgian wine will be lost. Despite the fact that we have good relations with our partners, the main thing is the consumer who enters the store and buys Georgian wine. This happened to countries with authoritarian regime, not only because the countries impose sanctions, but also because the consumer declared a boycott. Of course, this case, those winemakers and entrepreneurs who work in Western markets suffer now. We don't have new contracts. We don't even see where we can go and promote our wine. In fact, our hard work towards the West goes to waste, said Shalva Kurdadze. Protest rallies started since November 28, and recent developments in the country have already translated into economic crisis. Not only hotels but also hospitality establishments have found themselves in a difficult financial situation. Due to the fact that there are no guests in restaurants, the establishments have also had problems paying budget taxes. Restaurateur Vakhtang Kandelaki said in an interview with BMG TV that more than half of restaurants have failed to pay VAT as they spend their funds to pay employees' salaries and cover other expenses. The picture is complicated. More than 70% of the businesses were unable to pay VAT because they use funds to pay employees' salaries, distribution debts, and cover the other expenditures, Vakhtang Kandelaki said. Ska Juice Bar has issued a statement responding to questions and criticisms raised in the public regarding the company's political views. As the company's statement reads, they firmly believe in and support Georgia's European future. You know, certain questions have risen in public regarding our political views. We would like to make a short statement in order to clearly introduce everyone to SCA's vision and aspirations. SCA was founded in 2019 with the support of our American partner. After that, in 2024, we opened 2 branches in the heart of Europe in Prague with the help of additional American investment. Our vision and aspirations were based on Western values and business practice from the very beginning. We plan to develop in Western markets in the future and are proud to have the opportunity and privilege to represent our Georgian brand in Western markets. We firmly believe in and support Georgia's European future, this statement reads. For most a week, the businesses have been demanding the release of detained activists. More than 2,000 companies have already registered on the platform freebusiness.g. SCA is not among them. Part of the public criticized those businesses that have not joined the platform yet. PKK managing partner of Nutrimax declares that he could not get an answer on his question, how does the government plan to ease the tension at the meeting held with Prime Minister Irakli Kobakhidze. According to him, when asked what would resolve the polarization with the society, the government representative unfortunately did not have an appropriate answer. The Prime Minister talked about the crisis for a long time. The same thing we hear on television, that certain external actors, the global war party, are planning what is happening in our country, somewhere in Europe or America. I had the opportunity to ask the question how to solve the tension that is in our families, neighborhood or friendship. How does the government plan to get out of this? Unfortunately, we have not received an answer to this. There is no plan for this. The plan is to sort out the situation again in January, when external actors will no longer interfere in Georgia's internal affairs. Nothing new. Among them was the discussion of sanctions. The Prime Minister noted that naturally no one likes him and he also creates problems. However, all this will be solved after January 20, the businessman said. Beso Ortoidze, the General Director of RC, states that new elections and release of detainees are necessary to de-escalate the situation. According to Beso Ortoidze, in order to de-escalate the situation, the necessary demands are now posted on freebusiness.g. More than 2,000 companies expressed their position that now it's important to urgently de-escalate the situation. For this, we have demanded new elections and the release of detainees. We will listen and probably get a response from them, said Beso Ortoidze. Consumer activity in the country is decreasing, and there is talk of a sharp drop in sales in the retail sector. Some shopping centers, hardware stores, and online trading platforms say that they have had to adjust their sales plans for December, and the calculations that were made for most profitable months of the year have become unattainable due to the ongoing political processes. Hardware stores are also talking about a change in consumer behavior. This December is also their most profitable month of the year, although sales pace has slowed down. Here too, the head of marketing at iSpace says that due to the ongoing processes in the country, consumers are refraining from New Year's purchases for now. According to Ramakrishnan, if these processes continue, the effect of the current processes will become more apparent in 2025. Since these processes began, customer traffic has decreased, including demand and sales. We have suspended all communications since the first day of the protest, and naturally this had its impact. As for future plans, since it's December and the New Year period, there is still activity, but we have quite a few plans for 2024. We plan to open a new showroom for 2025. We are not just a hardware store, we also offer IT solution to our B2B customers. According to Justat, this sector has decreased by over 30%, and in fact, I can confirm that almost identical decline has been observed in our case, says Levant Tagiashvili, head of marketing at iSpace.
This was the last checkpoints of the season. See you in the new year, and follow us on BMG.
The Checkpoints is presented by pharmaceutical company GM Pharma.